taken most of what our meeting was about. I guess going through opens from previous weeks. I don't know if there's any progress. I did a little talking with Michael around the code issue or the use of issues. We're still working on that proposal. Hopefully next week we'll have that. I guess the CodeQL stuff, it sounds like we've already talked through that. Is there anything more you guys want to add in that now that we're live and recording?
I don't think so. I think Mike Kenny's going to check to see what we needed to do to get the action running in Edk2. Once that's done, I'd like to experiment a bit further with the queries and comparing some results in different build configurations. Also comparing to some of the results that we're getting through running CodeQL and other places on Edk2. Make sure that things are at least looking fairly consistent there. And I think we'll have a set, at least, like I think I mentioned this, Mike, that we'll have like a subset of fixes probably coming in. Do you a lot of the fixes, and you'll start to see this whenever the results come up, are going to be traditionally what I believe are well-known problems in Tiana Core, which is people asserting that critical memory allocations are not null, but then not actually returning if they're null. So those types of things, I think probably everyone every major firmware vendor that's run static analysis against Edk2 has probably seen those problems and has not fixed them. Do you think that there's going to be a lot of resistance to those types of fixes coming out, or is it just something that no one's fixed for some other reason over the last like 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, this is a more in-depth topic because of some different attributes of where the checks are performed, and there's some history about some of the size optimizations that were done.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that from a like an application environment, the idea of those asserts and always returning an error code if those asserts are removed is exactly the right thing to do, but you have a less space constrained environment in an application. In some of our firmware usages, some of the asserts are effectively identifying impossible conditions, and the only way that they are truly triggered is not due to a software bug, but maybe due to something that's like a hardware issue or something, going bad. That would only ever be seen during development, not during a production boot.
Yep.
Those aren't necessarily as common, but each one of those that may be identified by the static analysis tool, we have to evaluate to see if really for all the call points coming in, it's guaranteed that they'll never really trigger that assert. And unfortunately, in some cases, the API being called may not have a return value or return status that's usable.
Yeah.
So that's where things get in the nuances of complexity of where you may say, okay, yeah, we need to go add some more logic in this function, but you may not figure out, that it's possible. You may figure out it's not possible to actually do something different. And then what do we do in those scenarios? Is that truly a potential for a real software bug, or is that a impossible condition from a valid software construction perspective?
Yeah, I guess too, Mike, like historically, right, if we only have one allocator, right, so if that functions out of memory, everything else is going to fail downstream of it that tries to allocate memory. Which
all right, and that's where we've also had the discussions about it. Would a panic condition be more appropriate instead of an assert condition? And that's where these get nuanced, Michael. And that's where I think if there's ones that are obvious in that the API absolutely has a return code that makes sense, then those are an obvious one to update and return the appropriate value. But it's all the others we may have to set aside into a separate bucket and have a small group of the community members help review those together and figure out what's the right way to address it.
Yeah. I mean,
Very.
we ended up adding panic in our world for the stuff
Well,
where we needed
very few of the ones in MDE module package and MDE, I would say, are straightforward. Like most of them are in the dispatcher or the allocator, or somewhere in the core, where it's like in the middle of doing FV dispatch and something goes wrong, right? And then like, what do you do at that point? Like you're in the middle. And also in a lot of these loops, you get into fairly complex conditions where you can be like in 2 levels of loops, and you have to really evaluate the error handling coming out of the loop quite a bit. And so I think all of them are, or at least most of the ones I've seen, are kind of just the leftovers that have probably been difficult to resolve in the past. But we can bring them and talk about them, but I do think it's a lot of the same pattern, just in different places. So what happened with the panic lib discussion?
Yeah, I never really got it started, or no one really ran with it, so I never really kept pushing on it.
Okay.
I absolutely think it's worthwhile, but it does require some more discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to work on it with someone else if someone else wants to work on it.
Hey, Fish, when you say panic, what do you do?
Well, kind of depends, right? Like, so, like in, you end up kind of implementing a multiple layered kind of thing, right? Because you want to have sort of like a panic flow where you could redirect where the data goes, and then you want to also have some kind of platform action that you want to take. Like, so in our systems, like if we have a T2, we can actually like cross panic to the T2. So we can dump all the serial junk. Like if you take an exception and you get all that junk printed out, we can print that out to the T2, and the T2 cross panics, and then it's like a real OS. So then when it panics, its panic report says, hey, I cross panicked. Here's the panic string. Here's the panic information, which is like the register dump and the stack trace and the reason the exception happened kind of thing, right? Like in the virtual machines, there's actually a virtual panic device, but it's just a brain dead device that you toggle it, and the VM says it's panicked. So it sort of panics back to the user. It doesn't really allow you to move data around, but you can just, in that world, you can send, you can just send your panic information to your serial device, even if you're on a release field, and then you toggle this register. It's PV panic, I think. There's a virtual PV panic. It's literally just a register. You toggle it, and like QMU will say, hey, I panicked. The OS panicked, and then the CI wrapped around it. It's like, oh, you panicked. Right. So there's stuff like that. I know that come up. That's at least.
And there's some, if you look through the source code, there's places where asserts have been used where really they should be a panic, but there's other places where asserts are used where it makes no sense and should be converted to like a return error code.
Right.
I think the idea of the panic is it means that there is no chance of the system continuing past this point, right? Nothing good can happen past this point. And that's very different than, for example, if you come through a piece of logic that says, hey, I depend upon, a protocol being present, or for this feature to work, or I depend upon this hardware being present for this feature to work. And if that dependency is not there and it's considered an optional feature, then neither an assert nor a panic is correct. It's like, okay, we just continue to boot with that feature not enabled, and that's okay. But we have some misuse of the assert macro in some places, and those need to be converted to either a panic or a return error code and remove the assert altogether, because those assert use cases are don't make sense, because you don't really want to print an assert message or go into a dead loop for an optional feature, or generate a breakpoint for an optional feature.
Yeah, and sometimes people are error checking stuff, like you say, that should be present, and if it's not, something really bad's happened. So then it's a little less clear what to do. And from the panic point of view too, we also have, there's some code that just does like, CPU dead loop if it gets into a bad state because it doesn't expect to get there. So you could convert that to a panic as well, potentially, which that probably doesn't trigger the static analysis. So
I
Yeah,
think
we've just been talking about enhancing our error handling, and I was just kind of interested in what you were doing. Okay, thanks.
yeah, but basically, like, I have a library that, and it's kind of the same thing that hooks in the exception handler thing, right? So I ported the exception handler, my private fork stuff, lib, to use this infrastructure, and also published up a way to call the exception handler and tell it was a panic, not an exception, so it could go do the panic flow for you. Is kind of what I built off in my private world. That's not in sync with EDK2.
Right, neither are we.
Yeah, the thing I think we need to avoid is what's going on right now in EDK2, where like if you don't have asserts turned on, you just dereference a random pointer because the memory allocation failed, and then it's kind of like you're just like at that point definitely not going to go anywhere good. So if we had to, we could redirect the panic.
Right, and the really important thing here is that I think from a source style, I think having a panic macro that's similar in style to the assert macro is maybe the right source style to make available to firmware code. But you'd want to make sure that panic can never be filtered out of the build, right?
Yeah.
It is always, whether you're doing debug builds or release builds, it's always there and never goes away. And that's different than the debug macros and assert macros that can be enabled and disabled.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think the panic macro would be useful for the cases I'm seeing. So I don't know if that helps it get prioritized a bit more or not, but I think to help resolve some of these asserts in MDE and MDE module package, we're going to need something like that.
Okay, so I don't know, Andrew, maybe we could come up with a simple version of panic to start with, because I know that the nuances get really complicated for all the different platform scenarios, but maybe we can work towards a simple starting point that we can expand from.
Well, I think, Mike, just from having mucked with us, I don't think it's as complicated necessarily, right? Because if you have a null one, and then you can resolve stuff to make stuff link, right? Then we could just like build one for OVMF or in the ARM VM or whatever, and do some stuff there potentially. So it might not.
I mean, you could have a version of panic that supports basically the dead loop as the action, right?
Yeah.
And then as the empty one, and then the one that does something interesting that's a platform specific handler.
Yeah,
That's where
you make it 2 layers, right? Like I said, you have one that just does debug prints, even though that's not optimal.
Yeah.
As the null one, and have the default, hardware panic action be dead loop or whatever. And then, yeah. But yeah, I could definitely help if someone wants to work on that for sure. And then it's like the only problem is then if we introduce a new like MDE library, we have the whole we break compatibility for people that use it problem. But
Oh
yeah,
no, we've got the ink file for that now, so we
Yeah.
can add a new library class without breaking.
well, at least it's no
class.
worse than the other stuff. But yeah.
All right, if a separate work stream starts for that, I'd be interested in being involved. I'd at least be able to help do some work there and integrate it into a few places that probably need it.
All right, sounds good. I think that is all I had on the agenda. So if there's others that have something, I see Oliver's here today.
Yeah. Hello.
We can hear you.
Ah, okay. No, it doesn't work, right? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Ah, perfect. Yeah, my microphone was weird. Yeah. So I wanted to hear about the CI container efforts that were going on. There were some comments, some few meetings back, and yeah, I updated the Docker files and put new images and also sent new patches to the mailing list. Yeah, from my side, I don't know if there's much left to do. I wanted to hear if you have some comments on this, or yeah.
So I think from from my side, the only question was how this kind of gets integrated into CI. I think I was going to go review your pipeline changes one last time. But if you think they're ready, I guess I haven't heard any objection, and I'm curious if there's anybody who has concern about switching over to a container for the Linux builds. And this would be one, just to make it easier for anyone to be able to build on Linux and to be able to use a container that is ready to go. And two, and I think maybe most importantly, at least in the short term, was remove the dependency to pull down from the ARM developer site the GCC versions that are for ARM and ARM64, which have traditionally caused us a couple hiccups every year.
Yeah. The versions are also now pinned in the Docker file, so we don't like on accident pick up a new compiler version.
Okay.
This also addresses the OVMF. I'm sorry, the QEMU compatibility with Ubuntu that we have in current CI, right?
Yes. Oliver, did you get OVMF booting for the, I guess, OVMF package and the ARM vert package?
Yeah, it runs through like the whole CI runs through on the container. So yeah.
And that's pinned to the latest release of QEMU.
That's a pretty recent release of QEMU in there, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the only other open I kind of had is how do we maintain these Docker files? Who's going to update the versions? And kind of, do we need to put some ownership on it so that it's clear who's on point for that?
Mm-hmm.
And is that something you're willing to do, Oliver?
I could do that for now. If maybe somebody else would also be there if I'm not available, who's then helping out would be ideal, I guess, if this is not just on me. But in general, I could do that, yeah.
Okay. I think that sounds great. I guess any other comments, concerns? Has anyone else looked at the patch series? Or willing to look at the patch series?
I have no Docker experience, so I don't know what I'm looking at this point for the for review. Do we have anybody else that has Docker experience?
So I know Chris on my team was also doing a similar thing. So he's worked with Oliver a little bit on this, I think. But I need to go check with him to get this approved, I guess, get this reviewed.
Yeah, he reviewed the changes to the Docker files that I made every time. So he's like kind of involved. And that's good.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think it's better than what we have. I think it is takes control back from that VM that we've had a little bit of problems with. So I think it seems good. And if we have a process that, you know, ideally at least quarterly, maybe right after the stable tag, we can update the versions in there, then I think we're in better shape than today.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I guess the other thing to note is we are moving to Fedora, not Ubuntu anymore, and I don't know if anyone's concerned.
Yeah, but this could be changed if somebody has can also use Ubuntu now, I guess. This was just at the time had the newer versions of the tools available, so that's why I chose this. But
Yeah, I think the decisions that need to be made here is that we need to make sure we pick the right OS and tools that we need for our CI agents and keep those up to date as requirements change. And then the second element, which will be where we maybe get a family of Docker images, is if different developers have a preference for different OSs where they'd like to use a Docker image as a way to get set up their environment. If there's another developer or developers that are interested in Ubuntu, they could use the profile that you've got for Fedora and port that to Ubuntu, right, Oliver?
yeah, for sure.
Okay. And I think that's the way to handle it, Sean, is that's more of a community, need, not something that we should do proactively guessing what OSs developers want to use. They let the community, I think, expand that. And we could clearly tag which ones are used in CI and which ones are additional ones available for developers.
Yep, sounds good. Two questions I had. One, I see you're still using Python 3.9. I know that we're gonna have 3.11 here in the next couple months. Is that a problem, or is that something we can move forward? And then the other two questions were NASM and ACPI-CA, or the ACPI compiler. Maybe not NASM, because I think that's been pretty stable. I know we did Revit, or we did include a newer version because of some instructions, but for the most part, that's been pretty stable. But I know ACPI-CA, I've seen a lot of variation across products and places, and I guess I wonder if that shouldn't be a tool that we rely on the Linux distro for the version.
Yeah, we can also then change this in the Docker file that we pull it from somewhere else.
In our current CI, this is ACPI-CA is one that we do pull from a NuGet package. I'm not sure your Docker has NuGet support. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I install NuGet currently in the Docker file because it's still needed in some places.
Okay.
So we could just like get it from there as before. I just include it in when the image is built.
Yeah. Does anyone else have thoughts on those? I mean, I think NASM, we've done that as well, mainly because on Windows there isn't a repository that is easy to install from. So we did do NuGet, but that one's been pretty stable, like I said. But at least that ACPI has been a lot more variation across products. Are there any other tools that are included here that we think are generally deviate a lot more that we don't want to necessarily put into the container.
When you say don't put in the container, I want to make sure I understand what you're referring to there. I understand that there may be some default tools in the container based upon the OS image that was used, and then we have to then decide what version of what tools if we don't want the default version to have an explicit version. I'd recommend every tool that we directly depend upon to build firmware has an explicit versioned explicit version of the tool that's installed as part of the Docker container, so that then we can then make as a choice as the community to update to a newer version based upon evaluation and assessment before we update the version. So what tools in the current Docker container depend upon the version that was pre-installed by the Fedora image today?
I think you can once you're running the container, you can just update the versions that are installed before doing anything. I mean, this is possible, or you could then also like manually download other from a website or whatever. This is still possible.
I mean, it looks like, so I'm looking at the latest that's checked into the container repo.
Yeah.
And things like, the GCC compiler are versioned, Python's versioned, NASM's versioned, but things like Git are not versioned, or make. And, that probably makes sense in that I don't think we want to track too many of those things. I don't envision people are going to want to install a specific version of make. At least I hope not.
Yeah, I thought like there we might just leave it open so that we don't manually have to track all these version numbers, because I don't expect any big breaking changes in these tools.
Mike, does that match your expectation?
Yeah, I don't think I'm as worried about Git and make, but the compilers and the Python version and the NASM and ISL are the major ones that I think need to be explicitly versioned. And it does bring up an interesting point, because I know that once we get into PyTools, you're able to install more, right? So it's where do we draw the line between what the container does and what's in our PyTools configuration, right?
Yep. Yeah, that was my point, and I guess that's where I was thinking. At least where I landed was ACPI CA, or the compiler, was something that should get installed by the source code that you're trying to build as a dependency there. Whereas I think the rest of them I'm okay with.
Okay, so at runtime install these tools.
So again, that is why we do it. That's how we do it in CI today. That's how
Yeah.
we keep Windows and Linux the same, which is nice.
Yeah.
And again, across a lot of generations of products, I've seen ACPI compiler changes or different versions, and therefore I think that the version in the container would be less useful to developers, because they most likely want to control that version by the platform that they're building.
Yeah, we can just take these tools out of the Docker file, let's say, and then I mean the CI has this mechanism to pull dependencies anyway, and it would then pull everything that's not the compiler, more or less, from as it is doing it today, and we just ship just GCC and QEMU and Python with the image.
Yeah, that does bring up another interesting distinction between a CI use case and a developer convenience use case.
Yes,
right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it doesn't matter that like these tools are already installed in the container if you if the CI downloads them, because then it overrides the path where they're to find anyway. to the versions that it downloaded. So we can just ship a default version in the image, and if the CI then overwrites this, it's no problem.
That's an interesting point, right, Sean? That maybe the Docker images are try to stay up on the latest greatest that we consider stable. But if a specific platform needs to downgrade, that's fine, right?
Yeah, I was trying to think how the ASL compiler, right, is controlled by a macro. It's usually on the path, I think, is how it's controlled. Which I was trying to think how we could more definitively, we can't throw away the entire path, otherwise we lose stuff. So trying to get it out of the path might be difficult. I don't know. Am I making a deal out of something that isn't?
No, I mean, it sounds to me like some of that pathing in your build, right, assumes where things are located in your sandbox, right? And I think it's the same way for compiler versions, right? Because some of the compiler versions are different targets that you pass to the build. So those are
like
things
on Linux, if you install multiple versions of GCC, for example, there's a way to switch which one's the default one.
Yeah, I mean this is the same on Mac OS, but I guess the bigger point, Mike, is it just seems like there's some platform specific assumptions about the build environment. Like, how does that tie? How does that tie into the CI? You see what I'm saying? I mean, those things were built like decades before we had CI, right? I mean, I guess we kind of, you end up overloading the path that you use like for the ACPI tools, right? But that's like something you tweak for your repo. If you're going into some CI, how do you know where that path is? I mean, maybe we're both overthinking this, and this is just like a documentation kind of thing where we explain dependencies and that people might have to manage, or why things might break, like an FAQ or something.
Well, Sean, like from a practical perspective, the IASL step is going to set the path, right? And most builds.
So that's what I was trying to figure out how, like, I think what we ended up doing for ASL was we actually just put the directory that ASL gets pulled into on the path. And
Right.
then when ASL or iasl.exe was called, it found it, right?
Yeah, I can see in the X step it has the set path flag set.
But I think, just to back up, right? There's like, you don't have to make it in the path. You can give it an absolute from the build point of view, right? So it's documenting what's the best practice to get it to work with the CI, I think, is something that would be useful again, right?
Yeah, I was going to paste this here. Oh, didn't go yet. Basically, there is an IASL prefix that's supported in the default tools def. I just pasted that in the chat, but
well, does that mean we want to set the prefix from like whatever controls the CI?
So we could set it in whatever controls the CI to force it to the path we know of, right? It's just the current CI, the way we did it was we set the prefix to nothing and we just assumed it was on the path. And that was the easy way to do it. So that would be my only concern with defaults, is that I don't know how you would clean up the path and get rid of certain things before you ran your build. Because I assume
Mhm.
you'd want that there as the default, therefore it'd be on your path.
So is this really kind of a PyTools feature that needs to be reviewed? Because you can imagine if we look at the variety of developer and CI agent environments, we might want to run PyTools in. If the PyTools configuration for a platform is to specify specific versions of tools that it needs in order to do its build, to reproduce that build for that platform, we need a guarantee that PyTools will make sure that either that tool is installed or it will fail the build because it can't figure out how to get that version of that tool activated for that build. So no matter what's in the Docker image, if the platform says I need this version of GCC and ISL and NASM, PyTools has to try to get it there or fail to build it. It can't.
That is not a feature today. Yep.
But it sounds like a necessary one, especially for reproducible builds, right?
I mean, I think it's not a bad feature. I think today we were taking an optimistic approach that said if we set everything up as we go, then we'll get the versions we asked for. But no, I think you're right. It means it means we'd have to define a way to actually query the version of each thing you put in there in a way that, you execute the tool and can query the version. So that when you execute the tool with the path that your build system has, you confirm that it's the version you requested. So you can file that as a new feature if you want. I think, Oliver, in the short term, maybe we just drop ACPI CA and the rest of it I would be all good with, I think is pretty much aligns with usage, standard usage, I think.
Okay. So should I just remove it from the Docker file then and
I think that'll get us back to a known good place that it will have the
okay. And
content
then
switcher.
then we're sure that like the CI has to pull it in. And
CI will pull it in.
Yeah.
Yep.
And what's the version of GCC that's there by default?
So currently GCC is version 11.2.
Okay.
And I guess one more request, if you could try, is making Python 3.10. I don't think our use case for why we have to have 3.10, the zip compression problem that was only fixed in 3.10, because we're now no longer using the GCC X steps that pulled down a zip file. We don't need them. We don't need that fix, but I think it would be great to move to 3.10, given that 3.11's only a couple months away.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, and then I'll have Chris look over your pipeline files. And then I think this would be good. Yeah, I think getting into container would be
It's a
helpful.
start, right? We can change it then. Once we run on containers, we can change them easily. If we want something else underneath.
Yeah, I forget if there was a performance impact that was measurable or not. Do you know offhand?
I wouldn't think. Startup time is maybe like a few seconds longer because it has to like start up the container or even download the image, but this is over the whole CI pipeline. I guess this is pretty fast because there's also some caching. So I can look up how long my PR ran, but I don't think it ran much longer.
Okay, great.
Do we want to set a goal, Sean, for switching our Linux CI agents over to the Docker container just after the stable tag release in a few weeks at the end of August?
That seems reasonable to me. Oliver, are you good with that?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. And I know in this meeting there was some requests around a Windows container, not for performance, but for consistency. We will still look into that one as well. As maybe if everything moved to containers, and I don't know if Xcode could be moved into a container, but if it was, then maybe some of these other questions, you know, we would use PyTools for less environment management. We just assume the containers what the user wanted. Okay. Anything else from anyone?
I just had two quick questions. The first one is the HTML line break tag that we put in copyrights. Is that still super important? I think that's for Doxygen and stuff, right? I'm just trying to figure out how much to enforce that in code reviews.
The less than BR greater than tag at the end of the line.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering that myself lately. I think it's ignorable for sure. Present or not present, doesn't matter.
Okay. Because
I think the format we've got now is brief description followed by a copyright followed by a license, right? An SPDX license identifier preferred.
Yep.
And that's in the C coding standard. I don't think there's in the comment block, is there a line break between the copyright and the SPDX identifier? I think we've gotten rid of the no blank line between those two, right? To minimize the size of the file header.
That's what I'm seeing in most of the files that I've been looking at.
Okay. And the BR usage is inconsistent, right?
Correct.
Okay.
But it doesn't sound like we need to enforce that. There's no known reason today.
Yeah, I'd almost have to go back and look at the output of the Doxygen document generation from a file header with and without the BR to see if it messes something up. But if it did, I don't know if it's that important.
Well, I hate to be this guy, but generally, doesn't your lawyer tell you what your copyright should look like?
Yes,
Like,
so the you're exactly right. The copyright statement, the TNO core can make no statements about the requirement for a copyright statement, the updates to it, or the format of it.
Yeah.
We can't make a statement about what licenses are supported and reject code that doesn't fit our license requirements.
And I'm not totally convinced that BR didn't come from a lawyer at some point, but and get copied. But yeah. But in general, though, the verbiage of the copyright is generally dictated by the
copyright holder.
The copyright holder, yeah. So I don't think we want to be too picky about it.
Okay, I assumed it was a format. I mean, the line break is an HTML tag for formatting, right? I don't know if lawyers care about HTML. Like, that's why I was thinking we had to, for some reason, put that in our documents for a formatting reason. Like, I don't think the Intel copyright normally has an HTML line break tag at the end of it. At least, not the Intel copyrights I've seen outside our code base.
Yeah.
If it doesn't matter, then I won't enforce it. It's inconsistent, and I was trying to figure out how much of a deal to make out of that.
And you're looking at this from a from a Uncrustify perspective? Is that where you're looking at it from?
No, just like a manual code review perspective.
Okay.
Because it's like, it just looks a little weird whenever you look at a copyright section and like half of them have it and half of them don't. It's like, well, what's the point of the ones that have it if there's ones that don't have it?
I think Andrew's statement is correct. The format of the copyright line is up to the copyright holder, and if they're inconsistent, they're inconsistent. We don't have any comments on the code review for that.
Okay.
We might have, like you say, we might have just inherited from some Doxygen stuff or whatever, but it's still the copyright line from others.
Last one I had, just while we're here and we have a few minutes, I wanted to see if in this file, this goes back to CodeQL, if there's a reason why this check was only added for debug build. It's been there since the beginning of the file. So this goes back to like 2007. But it surrounds the check for hob list being null with the debug code. And I was wondering if that was like an optimization that was made for performance or something to not do that check. Basically what CodeQL is saying is that you should always do the null check.
Wow.
What's-
Okay. You said that code's been there since 2007.
Yes.
So yeah. So hob list is a double pointer. So if hob list is null, we're going to write in at 0 if a bad hob list is passed in to get hob list, right?
Right.
And
Yeah,
that would cause a
this
null pointer.
feels, yeah, this just feels like an ancient performance tweak when running from the ROM was super slow.
Well, this was one in particular that just seemed a little strange to me, so I wanted to ask while we were here. I was planning for this one to just get rid of the debug code macros. Obviously,
that would make sense. Now, is this in the library? This is in the this is in the PEI core. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, because I've seen some other unusual scenarios where like the core may or may not have a return status, but the library may have a return, the opposite return status. One has return status, one doesn't, between the lib and the core service.
Yes, I've seen that.
Which makes this really, really hard to deal with. So I didn't know if this was potentially related to that. Your suggestion of removing the debug code begin and end looks like a good idea. You agree, Andrew?
Yeah, like I said, this feels like some ancient performance tweak because like running from ROM was super slow for some reason.
What does the blame say, Michael?
It goes back to NT32 something. I'd have to go look at it again. The very first one on PEI, add PEI core module enabling for NT32 package.
So it was imported directly.
Yes, that's what it looks like.
We'd have to go back to the EDK1 code base to figure out why we did this. Okay.
Yeah, it's likely performance thing.
Okay. Well, thanks for the feedback.
All right. Well, if nothing else, then we can break for the week.
All right. Thank you, Sean.
Yep. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.